Chapter 20, The Progressives. Here we go. Progressivism occurred from 1900 to about 1917, and there are many different ideas about what progressivism was. One of the beliefs was that the government really needed to intervene in the economy. They felt that these monopolies were very bad, so there was a lot of people who had the belief, the anti-monopoly, the belief that the concentrated wealth was bad and that we needed to disperse the power and the wealth throughout the country. There was also the belief of social cohesion where it said, listen, the wealth of a single person is dependent on the welfare of the society. We need to make sure that the normal citizen is doing well, therefore it's going to help the rest of society. They did have faith in knowledge principles of natural and social sciences and modernized government. So they liked that we were improving. It's just they felt like the government needed to intervene, that all were improving, not just the super wealthy. How in the world did people find out about these social ills in society? Well, it was because of muckrakers. Everybody was reading newspapers at the time, and the muckrakers were journalists that were exposing these issues, whether it was in the economy or politically. We're seeing them expose the injustices and corruptions within these groups. First thing they went after were the trusts, especially the railroad trusts. Ida Tarbell, for instance, he went after Standard Oil. He actually wrote a couple articles and then even some books about it. And then later we see the most prominent muckraker at the time, Lincoln Steffens, expose the political machines like what we saw with Tammany Hall in New York City with Boss Tweed. And that's when we start seeing urban reform because of what he exposed at that level. Religious groups became outraged by what they saw the muckrakers exposing, so they formed their own groups to help out society, and this was known as the social gospel movement, created basically by Protestants, where they wanted to fuse religion with reform. Salvation Army was the major group that started this in the United States. It was a Christian social welfare organization that was meant to help the poor, especially those living in urban squalor. Ministers left their parishes, left their comfy lifestyles basically to go live among them in the cities to make lives better. Father John Ryan, for instance, he went to the cities and wrote of how the Catholic Church needed to also get involved in expanding to social welfare programs rather than just the Protestants doing this. So what did religion do? It basically brought a moral component to progressivism, which kind of got a lot more people on board. It wasn't just, a secular thing that the government needed to get involved in. Religious groups could get involved in it as well. There are groups of progressives that also believe that the environment that someone lived in influenced their development, and they felt that when they saw crowded immigrant neighborhoods or neighborhoods in urban areas that had terrible poor conditions, that they really needed help, because if you improve their environment, you're going to improve their position in society. So they created settlement houses, the most famous of that being Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, which helped immigrants basically adapt to the language and culture of the country and get those who were without homes off of their feet. And they felt that it was the middle class's responsibility to make sure that they helped them get off their feet and have a better life, because it would just help. It's that social cohesion. The welfare of one will help the welfare of all of society. Who usually did this? College-educated women who weren't married. Another group of progressives also believe that science, knowledge, expertise is what we're really going to get society to move forward. And many believe that if you had that, it could create a oiled machine of a bureaucracy that could really run the country into the right direction. The person who wrote a book about this, Thorstein Veblen, great name, wrote A Theory of the Leisure Class, basically to say that if you use science to create that bureaucracy, it's going to make society better. And this, because of this belief, we see the rise of social sciences, woohoo, using to be helped in creating a better society and political institutions. When we're focusing right now on professional jobs and progressivism, we kind of see a butterfly effect where one thing happens and it leads to the next thing and leads to the next. In the late 19th century, we see this huge emergence of professional jobs. We see the middle class start to flourish. The types of jobs we're looking at are like managers, scientists, lawyers, teachers, doctors. And as a demand for these professional jobs grew, so did the number of people in it. But here's what happens. With this demand growing, we start seeing this creation of these professional organizations that want to reform this. They're like, we're getting so big, we need to make sure that we have this set and concrete and we're doing the right thing and we're making sure we're the best that we can be. Who were the first to do this? The doctors. They created the American Medical Association in 1901 that basically had strict standard codes of what it meant, how to become a doctor. You had to make sure that the government licensed you as a doctor, and that's when we start seeing the real rise of the rigorous scientific training that a lot of the, if you know anyone who's ever been in medical school, you know it's tough stuff. Instead of being like, I am a doctor, like we saw back then before doctors really had to do anything to get certified. And then other professions started following suit, including lawyers, where they had to pass the bar exam, and businessmen, where they created the Chamber of Commerce. Women at the time weren't really involved in these professions. There's about 5% of all doctors were women, same with lawyers. Most of the women were in what were known as helping jobs. About 90% of professional women were teachers, and then we also saw women become professionals in nursing. We saw that really switch over to a woman's role during the Civil War. Speaking of 51% of the population, we're going to focus on women for Section 2. The new women are changing during this time. What's happening? Well, they are more involved in the society and the economy for several reasons. Number one, women had to work outside the home to pay for their families if you were a working mother. Also, children were enrolled in schools for much longer, so there was much less need for women to be at home since their kids were going to be gone at school. The new technologies that were had during this time, that were created during this time, including running water, electricity, refrigerators, that kind of stuff, made housework less of a burden, so women could focus more on working, or they could focus more on their children going to school and things like that. And a lot of times we saw, like, as women's generations, from grandmother to mother, they were having less children than their grandmas or their mothers before them. Boston marriages were happening between women who had lived together that just didn't feel like getting married. So there were a lot of people who weren't even getting married at the time. Also, the divorce rate was rising by about 10%. Women were also forming clubs at this time. Now, at first, they started more as like social clubs, basically a networking group that that was meant to just, be a way to connect with women. But then it started turning into more of a reform movement. The first major social club, the General Federation of Women's Club, they started as cultural, to work with women, but then eventually they went for the social betterment of women. Clubs often represented the effort to extend the women's influence outside of the traditional role. At first, they decided to go after local and state legislatures to get better working conditions for not only women but for children as well. And then they asked her to keep going with food inspection and temperance movement. And they were also a group, the Women's Trade Union League, who wanted to get women to be involved and accepted into labor unions. Women were also pushing for suffrage at this time, enfranchisement, the right to vote, however you name it, and this was pretty successful. At first they weren't. They were just like, hey, we want the exact same rights as men. We should be able, it's our natural right to vote, and men just found that too extreme at the time. It seems normal now, but it was seen as extreme. So women realized they needed to do something else, so they started to get more organized. They created the National American Women's Suffrage Association that was created by Anna Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. And they decided to go with more of a safer, moderate approach that we're trying to appeal to men. And they're like, listen, we'll bring special virtues to voting. We could still keep our distinct sphere, but we'll have a different viewpoint, a point of view when it comes to voting. We could also kind of soothe the male aggression, keep us out of war, be more pacifists. In 1910, Washington State extended the right to vote to women, and then after that, many more states did. Not really in the East, more so in the West, they were extending the right to vote. Because Catholics in the East were kind of like holding it back. But by 1920, after World War I, the 19th Amendment was passed that gave all women enfranchisement, suffrage, the right to vote. Alice Paul was like, let's take this one step further. Why don't we have an equal rights amendment? And everyone's like, shut up, don't say anything. Not yet, it's too soon, and we'll find out even in the 1970s they thought it was too soon. Section 3 talks about another thing that the progressives went after, and that was attacking the parties. Why did they do this? Well, at the end of the 19th 19th century, the end of the 1800s and the Gilded Age, we saw the populist movement. They went after the big parties because they felt like they were just way too powerful. And one thing they got out of it was the secret ballot, which is good because now people can vote how they want, not feel pressured by someone who's working the office saying, "Are you sure you want to vote Republican? Are you sure you want to do that?" You know, you don't. They have no say in it. What did they do? They argued that the party rule could be dealt with by increasing the power of the people, hence the People's Party, the Populist Party, and they felt that they could do it in a nonpartisan way. Well, the first thing they went after were cities. They felt like that's where the party had the most power were in cities, so they went after municipal reform. They went after the city bosses, the political machines, and tried to reform that. Who exposed it? Again, it was the muckrakers. Progressives came up with some really unique ideas at the time to create reform at the municipal levels. The first thing was the commission plan. Basically, in Galveston, Texas was the first city to do this. They would replace the mayor and the city council with nonpartisan commission to run the city. They also did something similar to this in the city manager plan, where they would basically have elected officials hire somebody who was an expert in city management to run the government. It's not very democratic per se, but that's how pathetic things were at the time. The democracy that we were seeing was really corrupt and basically full of injustices. So they had to do things like that, very undemocratic things, to make sure that democracy was run the way it was supposed to again. Who was the most successful at doing this on their own? An elected official who actually caused reform and went after special interests. That would be Cleveland's mayor, Tom Johnson. So we start seeing progressives go after the state levels too. They're like, some of these cities, like in Chicago or New York, they're not going to be able to get anything done. So they decide to go at the state level, and because they were pretty competent too, they were corrupt and unfair. So they were like, well, what can we do? How can we get around these people? And the progressives came up with some really great ideas. 4 actually: initiative, referendum, direct primary, and recall. So let's look at each one of those. Initiative is the idea where you get a petition going around and reformers could submit legislation onto a ballot. So you and me, we the people, the voters, could vote on legislation, and that vote is known as a referendum, whether or not we want a certain law to be passed. Recently, for instance, around here, we saw the Sandwich Library put on a referendum of whether or not we want to raise taxes to pay for them to build a new library. Instead of waiting for the state, be like, all right, well, let's go down there, Springfield, get this done. That we just did it directly. We also see the progressives at the time make direct primaries, where instead of waiting for having city bosses choose who gets to run for a position in the Democrats or the Republicans, we the people get to choose who that one person is that's going to run for political office. We also see recall. If we don't like a politician we voted in and they have a long time before their position, their tenure is up, then we can recall them earlier than when their actual position is up. We actually have seen that happen. California's done that with their governors, and we created that law in Illinois. We passed that law in Illinois recently because of that Rod Blagojevich guy who was kind of a little corrupt. I don't know. I mean, I think he got thrown in jail for it or something. I'm not really sure. The famous state level reformer was Governor Robert Lafayette of Wisconsin. He did lots of different things that actually helped make reforms happen in Wisconsin, like regulating railroads, workplace, and created graduated taxes on inherited wealth. These reforms did not destroy parties. They just kind of showed a decline in the voter turnout for these parties. But we also see at the same time a rise of interest groups that emerge, and these interest groups basically are organizations or professional or labor organizations that want to advance their own demands that aren't a political party. Section 4, we're going to look at who was causing the social reform, not what was happening, but more who was doing it. First group we're going to look at is the labor unions. Now, Samuel Gomper's AFL wasn't really involved, but we do see a lot of labor unions at the local and state levels trying to make reform laws for working conditions. Parties were actually involved in it a little bit. We especially see this in Tammany Hall in New York City, trying to be a vehicle for social reform. One thing that happened in New York that really pushed the Tammany Democrats to make reform in working conditions was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where in 1911, 146 women were killed in a factory because they were locked into the building. That's just how it was back then. There was one door and the boss locked it to make sure they didn't escape. Well, it killed them. And because of that, Tammany Democrats met and said, listen, we got to make some regulations on factory owners and make sure that they follow them and make sure that these laws are enforced. In the West, they tried to target the federal government because the Western governments were pretty weak and they didn't really do anything to take care of the railroads and water projects and just basically regulation over the big businesses who were trying to take over the West. They really didn't have much. But at the same time, that worked in their favor because their government was so weak. They actually were able to go after the state and local governments and get reform done more quickly than they were in the East because of the powerful political machines that were stopping it. African Americans were facing many struggles during this time too. There were so many obstacles to keep them from having equal rights, and at the time, many were big believers in Booker T. Washington's idea of self-improvement over a long period of time. He realized that gradually working their way towards civil rights was the way to go. But there were others that disagreed, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who created the Niagara movement in 1900 in the 1900s that said, you know what, we need immediate civil rights and we need to have professional education. We're not going to build, be bricklayers and that's going to get our way, into having equal rights. We need to be professionals. That's going to get us equal rights. And from there, he actually created more of a national movement. He joined with white reformers in 1909 and created the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And how did they go about it? They went about it through legislation, through litigation. Not legislation. And litigation is just going through court cases, and they were able to get some things successfully promoted in their favor. In Gwynn versus the United States, the grandfather clause was considered unconstitutional. In Buchanan versus Worley, the Supreme Court outlawed some segregation. So in that case, they were successful, and it became, after that, the leading black organization in the United States, and is still one of the most predominant ones today. The temperance movement during this time period was in full force. There were a lot of reasons that people wanted temperance, and they were all different types. Women wanted it because they thought it was a problem for families. Employers wanted it because they felt like they didn't want their workers coming to work drunk, and it was hurting their production and efficiency. And politicians felt that it was just the machine's way of getting more power into cities, and the political reformers wanted to get rid of that. So the temperance movement was pushed by women especially, and they created the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1873, and it got pushed even more to a national level in the early 1900s. There were people who were against it. The working class and the immigrants were mostly against this, but it was to no avail. Once we got to World War I, it became more of a moral issue because morality was huge during World War I, and they pushed it then, and 18th Amendment got passed in 1919. The second large wave of immigration was happening during this time in the United States, and progressives were trying to figure out how to deal with the issue. Some felt that you could limit the flow of immigrants. Others felt just let them come in, but we got to make sure to assimilate them. Again, we're trying to see what to do about the problem. So guess what happened? Eugenics! Yay! Came about during this time, and it's the idea of learning the different genetics in humans and how that makes them fit for society. And unfortunately, a lot of these eugenics scientists were coming up with the ideas that only certain groups, basically Northern Europeans, were fit to be part of the American society, while non-Northeastern Europeans and Asians were not. So there were certain groups that figured out that, especially publicist Madison Grant, that figured out that eugenics and nativism were kind of tied together. They, like people who were against immigration promoted eugenics, and they wanted to restrict immigration groups based on nationality, not necessarily on an overall number. Others who supported this felt that it would be a great way to stop overcrowding in the cities and violence. The socialist movement was strongest in American history during this time period, progressive era. People wanted to move forward, well, so did the workers of the world. And the socialist movement was under the leadership of Eugene Debs at the time, and was also mainly supported by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a union that wanted to have a universal union for everybody. They also wanted the government to run businesses and be the managers of major industries, nationalize these industries. The IWW also wanted to get rid of what they felt was a wage slave, which basically They wanted to make sure that everybody was getting paid more equally, not so little. They were kind of looking for a minimum wage. By 1917, though, because of the need to massively produce for the Great War, the IWW and all unions were shut down. They could not strike or have any type of dissident towards their managers because of the war effort. And after that, the idea, and because socialists were pacifists and didn't want to fight this war, it was a combination of that and the war itself that led to the socialist decline. People at the time were still worried in a capitalist sense about capitalists becoming too big, and we see the very few running the entire country, and that made people nervous. But they didn't necessarily want the government to get involved. They wanted to have these businesses self-regulate. They wanted to make sure that they did it themselves because they felt like by getting rid of competition, that hurts efficiency, and that's what capitalism was all about, competition and being efficient. Louis Brandeis said that it was a curse. We need to get rid of this bigness, as he saw it, because it would allow for more freedom. And then others went one step further. They said, okay, maybe the government might get involved, but sometimes trusts aren't that bad if they're done for good reasons. So we need to bust the bad trusts, not necessarily get rid of the good ones. Hopefully by the government getting a little bit active and just telling these businesses what to do to regulate themselves, that would help the economy. In September of 1901, President McKinley unfortunately was assassinated, and he had his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, or how he liked to be commonly called TR, take over. And he was cautious at first, but then as he moved into his presidency, he was definitely more into some radical changes. So what were they? Roosevelt felt the government, when it came to big business, should be a mediator rather than an actual buster of these businesses. He felt some of them could be busted, but he wanted to be more of a trust regulator rather than a trust buster. And he did so by creating departments in his cabinet, like the Department of Labor and Department of Commerce, to investigate these large corporations. He did bust a few, like some of the railroads in the Northwest, but again, he wasn't really a buster of trusts. He was a regulator. He felt that it was also the government's job to get involved in any type of strike. His first test of that was in 1902 when the United Mine Workers went on strike, and he sent in federal arbitrators to make sure, and he went as well, to fix the situation. And he basically said, listen, we're coming in, and if you don't do anything about it, we're shutting you down. TR was the first modern president of the United States because he did several things. Number one, he made himself known to the public and actually got involved in the public. And he used that popularity in order to promote and progress his different programs. And his big overall program idea was known as the Square Deal. He was the first one to kind of come up with a name for these things as well. Now, he didn't necessarily push it in his first term in office because he realized that he wanted to keep conservative Republicans on his side. So he waited to really push forth his New Deal efforts until he got reelected in 1904. Square Deal. Ugh, gross. First thing he did once he won re-election in 1904 is that he promoted the Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act, where government had more regulation over what the railroads could do, including prices and things like that. He also supported Congress's passing of the Food and Drug Act, which basically made sure that there was the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, who inspected food and drugs, because at the time, as I had taught you in class, a lot of the drugs were, and even food, were laced or had cocaine, opium, even alcohol in it when they really shouldn't have. He also, after reading The Jungle, which was about the meatpacking industry in Chicago and how gross it was, he's like, oh, it's disgusting. He passed the Meat Inspection Act because of it. And he also promoted things like a shorter workday, 8-hour workday, workmen's compensation, and he was actually for a federal income tax. TR was also our first green president. He was our first tree-hugging president. He was for the environment. So what did he try to do? He realized that the unregulated exploitation of the resources in the wilderness was really getting out of control. So he wanted to conserve this by making new management and developing some scientific methods to make sure that these areas were being managed correctly. First thing he did was he went with public reclamation and irrigation projects where he was reclaiming land that the government had given away as government land. The Newlands Act, or the National Reclamation Act, basically reclaimed land to build dams and reservoir and canals in the west to help with power, irrigation, and cultivation. Also, he wanted to preserve land. Not only did he want to do that, conserve it and use it in the right way, but he wanted to preserve it so like nothing was being done with it. Now, some things, the National Forest System, he did allow for lumbering, but it had to be rational lumbering, I guess. It's one of those ambiguous words that, people aren't following that much. But he also did grow the national park system with millions and millions of acres not being allowed to be touched. Like with any presidential tenure, there's always going to be some type of controversy, and in TR's case, the one was over the environment. The Hetch Hetchy Valley controversy was all about whether or not to use land to preserve it or to use it in order to conserve the environment and make sure that you build dams and reservoirs for cities' needs. And this was an area, the Hetch Hetchy area valley, was in Yosemite National Park, and they were deciding, do we leave it preserved and just the park, or do we build a dam on it and a reservoir in order to create power for the cities? And his top forest advisor, Gifford Pinchot, he said, we got to build the dam. And a lot of the naturalists were like, don't do it. But TR decided to build the dam. He's like, I don't know. I think we should build a dam, but let's put it up to a vote. And there was a referendum over it, and most people believe that we needed to build a dam on this area and help the cities. We're having another panic. This time it's in 1907. Why? Because of overproduction and bad management on the behalf of the major industrial moguls. So J.P. Morgan was able to help out with the banks. He got, even though TR wanted to regulate the trust, he was okay with some of them. They were a good trust, so he allowed U.S. Steel to buy out Tennessee Coal and Iron Company to build a stronger trust, and it was just to help bail out the banks. But because of the panic in 1907 and because of the promise he made in 1904 to stick with George Washington's precedent of not running for more than 2 terms, TR chose not to run again in 1908 and decided to handpick the next president, who is William Howard Taft. So Taft, well, he pretty much didn't do a good job when he was president. He kind of blew it. The reason being is because he was very divided. The Republican Party was divided. There were the old guard Republicans who were anti-TR, and then the progressive Republicans who were pro-TR. And he pretty much took the side of the old guard Republicans, which really upset TR because of the fact that TR's like, hello, I kind of picked you because you were like me. What's going on? And he did a lot of things that really upset the Republicans and just split them apart even further. The first being the Payne-Aldrich tariff, where the old guard Republicans didn't want to reduce tariffs because they want to protect American businesses, where the progressive Republicans said, yes, reduce the tariffs, because if you have lower tariffs, there's more products that are more affordable for the American people, and that's what we want to do, is help the welfare of the American people. Well, Taft kind of hemmed and hawed about it, and he pretty much passed it by saying, okay, I'll reduce some tariffs, but in reality, if you look at the overall picture, tariffs got increased. He also had an issue where there was a dispute between 2 of his top bureaucrats, being Bollinger and Pinchot. They were arguing over something that Pinchot found out about Bollinger. He found out, Pinchot, who was the head of the Forest Service system, he found out that the Secretary of the Interior, who was Richard Bollinger, had sold Alaskan lands illegally to private investors, and he brought it to Taft's attention. He's like, listen, your Secretary of the Interior is doing things illegally. He's selling land that's not his to sell. And Taft, instead of actually investigating it, he just kind of blew it off. He's like, that's groundless. So Pinchot got so ticked off at Taft for not looking into it, he leaked that information to the press. Taft got ticked off, fired Pinchot, who was one of TR's top bureaucrats at the time. So TR got really upset about this too, to the point where in 1910 he's like, you know what? Come 1912, I'm running against this guy again. We got to have a new Republican group. We've got new nationalism. I know conservation is important, but in reality, what we really need to do is have the government control what's going on, the federal government being strong, in order to have these social injustices eradicated. The 1910 midterm elections proved disastrous for the Republicans because they were split, because TR openly criticized Taft. we see many Democrats winning seats and a lot of the old guard Republicans that were incumbents losing their seats in Congress. And the Democrats took the majority in both the House and the Senate, and with a Republican president, nothing's going to get done. It's a divided government. So there is reform sentiment on the rise. The Democrats want reform. You know, the progressive Republicans, the TR Republicans want reform. And Roosevelt was like open in his mouth. He's like, listen, I'm not trying to like oust Taft. I'm just trying to pressure him to do as I did. But then he kind of reneged on that, and he decided to run in 1912 for the presidential nomination. He did that after one of the major things, like the straw that broke the camel's back per se, was when Taft said that the U.S. Steel and Tennessee Coal and Iron Company merger, that trust, was illegal. TR got really upset about it because he allowed that to happen. So what was it like running against TR? Well, TR actually tried to get the Republican nomination, but because Taft was the incumbent, it's just common courtesy to give it to him. So he got the nomination. So TR's like, fine, I'm out. He leaves the Republican Party, starts his own third party known as the Progressive Party, but was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. The major Democratic candidate for the 1912 election was Progressive Woodrow Wilson. The Democrats wanted progression too, probably even more so than not necessarily the Republicans, but the TR Republicans, the Bull Moose Progressives. He supported his idea of new freedom, where he held that the big businesses, needed to not be regulated like TR thought. They just needed to be destroyed, completely destroyed, dismantled, no more monopolies. And he was able to win. He only won with a plurality of the popular vote, but he won the overall election because of the split on the right with TR and Taft. Wilson got to work right when he came into office. Why? Because both houses of Congress were in charge by Democrats, so he was able to get things done. First thing he did was lowered tariffs. He lowered them with the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, which drastically lowered tariffs, but he still had to figure out how to make up that revenue. So with that, Congress and the state legislatures passed the graduated income tax with the 16th Amendment to make sure that they made up that money. Now remember, graduated income taxes mean that the more you make, the bigger percentage you pay. And like I had said before, he promised never to go over 6% in the highest tax bracket, when 2 years later, in 1917, he went up to 77%. He also passed the Federal Reserve Act, which basically made a central banking system where that bank could support regional banks by giving discount rates on interest. And they were also the ones that created the Federal Reserve notes, or cash currency, what you know as being money, that would be backed up by the government, and it shifted all that responsibility, that monetary policy, to the Federal Reserve Board, or the Fed as it is called. In 1914, he also did some work to get rid of trusts by passing the Federal Trade Commission and the Clay Antitrust Act. The Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, was done to make sure to monitor unfair trade practices. It still exists today. And the Clayton Antitrust Bill went in to completely dismantle the trust that the Republicans had only weakened under FDR. They just hadn't got, or not FDR, gross. I'm doing it again. Under TR, that he just regulated them. Now he's like, they're done. They're broken up. By 1914, Wilson, who'd been in office for a whopping 2 years, pretty much was like, okay, boys, I'm done. I got what I wanted done. Everything's good. So he refused to look at anything like suffrage or equal rights or civil rights, because I don't know if you know this about Wilson, but besides Andrew Jackson, he is our most racist president, so he really didn't care. But then he started to have to care, because by 1914, in the midterm elections, the Republicans won a majority of the seats in both the House and the Senate. So he's like, geez, I got to do something now. So he went back to working on reforms. So some of the things that he did that were seen as reforms, or seen as progressive, was putting Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court, passing the Keating-Owen Act, which dealt with child labor laws, and also increasing more agricultural education. So that's it for Wilson. The next chapter we're going to talk about is how he has to deal with this little thing called the Great War. So, Thorson, forward.